Well, hello there, my dear children of the apocalypse. How are you doing today? Welcome back to chess, which I've been playing addictively for the last, I want to say, pretty much the last year. Now, this is related to a rather painful story, but unfortunately, in February of last year, my granddad passed away. And he was a huge chess player, and he suffered from a stroke all the way back in I think 2012, or even a little bit earlier, 2009 perhaps. And as a result of it, I lost a person with whom I could have a meaningful conversation with. He was sort of unable to converse. However, the old man could still play chess like there was no tomorrow. And I remember, trying to beat him, and it just I would always blunder, I'd always make mistakes. He was just better. And it wasn't until a couple of weeks before he passed away that I was able to beat him for the first time, and I could see happiness in his eyes. It was almost like he knew that he had passed on this, this knowledge and experience, and it really gets to me. And so chess is important for me. It's an important factor of my life, and I find it to be a real pleasure for me today to show this to you. So before I get all emotional, chess, I play it a little bit different. In general, the rules that you follow is you try to take control of these 4 squares in the middle. And for those of you who are complete beginners of chess, these are pawns. Pawns move either 1 move forward or 2 moves forward if it's the first move. So when the pawns haven't yet moved, they can move 2 steps forward. Then you have the king. The king can only move 1 square at a time. The queen can move anywhere, anyhow, in all directions. Is the greatest piece in the world, sort of like women in real life. The bishops move only on their respective colored pieces. So the bishop on the black will only be able to move on the black pieces, and the bishop in the white will only be able to move on the white pieces. The knight, being the most dangerous of them all, moves 2 front, 1 left, or 2 front, 1 right, which can be very, very difficult. You can get yourself forked, as we say. And the rook will move vertically or horizontally. That's all we have to know. So let's have a look at the Polish opening. The Polish opening opens with b4, pawn to b4. And it is a tricky opening with the idea of getting the bishop onto this long diagonal and targeting the other bishop on the other side. Most people in this position will reply with pawn to e5. And there's 2 things. Again, it grabs the center, right? This pawn now controls these 2 squares. And their next move, probably intuitionally, will be this, to control also these 2 squares. And the idea being that this is just standard opening theory. However, what it also does, as you can see now, it releases an attack of the enemy bishop on our bishop. So what I usually do here is I bring my own bishop out, as if nothing's going on. The enemy now has an option. They can grab this bishop, they grab the pawn with the bishop, and I will do so myself. And this is where a lot of mistakes can be made. This is the very first trick of the Polish opening, and that is that should the bishop not retreat back to its original square to protect this pawn, then, let's just say they attack me and they say, what are we going to do now? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just simply take your rook, because this rook cannot move anywhere. And even if the knight goes somewhere, the rook will still fall. So what most people tend to do in this position, should I take, all the good moves include, so moving the bishop all the way back, bringing out this pawn, bringing out the knight. Those are 3 ways that you can combat this. Theoretically, I think even queen to there would be a good idea, but I'm not going to go too far into that. Usually, what actually happens after bishop is moved to b2, the enemy will play knight to c6. And it makes sense, right? This knight now attacks this pawn which is hanging, and it protects this pawn which is hanging on their side. What had to happen now is I just simply push this pawn forward. And I say once again, what are you going to do with your knight? There's a couple of options. The knight can go here, which is not a bad move. The knight can go here, and if it does, it will be lost. And the knight can go here. Let's have a look what happens if the knight moves under the pawn. Well, quite simple. Either of these 2 moves will trap the knight. Why? Let's have a look. This knight can only move to these places, right? The red squares represent where the knight can go. This is controlled by the pawn, and this is controlled by the pawn. So if the knight wants to go down here, the rook will capture. If the knight goes here, the queen will capture. If the knight goes here, the pawn will capture. So he is forced to retreat back to this square. The reason why this is important to note is because some players, unlike opening with the e pawn, will open with the d pawn. And apologies, they'll open with the... Great, my mouse has just stopped working, so give me a second. Logitech, please fix your problems. The reason why that's a problem is because after opening with a d pawn, let's say, and this is where we bring the knight out, when the knight is dispersed, and now we have this position, suddenly this space, which before was enabled, right? When we had this pawn moved, the knight could retreat. Now the knight cannot retreat. Instead, we're now trapping the knight in. And usually we trap him with this move, meaning the knight can no longer escape. And their best bet is to either go here, claim a check, which will do nothing, or at least get a pawn in return for their efforts. So usually the person will then do this, and the game will continue. So to go back to the beginning of the move b4, the enemy replying with the classic response of e5, and then us bringing out the bishop, and then bringing out the knight, and us kicking out the knight away, what tends to happen is this move is played. Why? Well, this is a brilliant move. It blocks our bishop's sight of the free pawn, and the knight is now also attacking our pawn, which is hanging. And there's a mental trick that I use in this position, which is when the enemy player makes this move, I wait about a second or two, and then I make this drastic move, which seems really, really bad, because usually what they do is they just take the pawn. What they forget, however, is that when we made this move of the pawn, we didn't just attack the knight. The idea of moving this pawn isn't to attack the knight. I mean, that's the effect of it. But the idea is to release the bishop and the queen. And so after this knight takes, what they don't expect is the bishop. And so now we are up a full 2 pieces of points, a full piece, essentially. And from this move on, there's a lot of ways that this game can go, but most likely the enemy will try to kick the bishop away, the bishop will return back, and the game will continue. Keeping in mind, this pawn is still hanging. So should the enemy do something unwise, like doing the knight, we can go right back to munching on that piece. And this really is all the basics of the French opening, and that is usually how I go about playing it. So if we switch the board up and we have a look at the opposite side, we're now having to play against white. And let's say white plays the most basics of moves and the most traditional of moves. They play e4. What we're going to do here is we can no longer play from this side. Keep in mind, chessboards, you have to flip everything up. So before we were playing b4 with this pawn, we can no longer do this. And the reason why this side doesn't work, very, very briefly and simply explained, is because the pawn that we were before targeting is now protected by the queen. It's no longer a free pawn. So we have to mirror this image and instead play b5. b5 doesn't work, because if we make b5 now, they will just take. So instead, you only play b6. So it's not quite the Polish, but it's the closest thing to it that I could find. And the usual continuation looks something like this, and then they will bring the knight out to protect this pawn. And then what we will do is we will open up this pawn, and they will bring out another knight, and then we will move the bishop here. And at this point, there's only one move that the enemy should play if they want to save this piece, and that is to play bishop to d3. Usually they don't. Usually what they do is they'll play the bishop out, and then we will simply trade. And at this point, our bishop jumps in, steals that free pawn, and then after being attacked, or whatever might happen, let's say they bring this bishop out, we will just return back to our normal position. And again, the idea being that we've just stolen a pawn from the enemy, and that gives us a slight advantage in that chess game. So let's have a look at the white pieces. So we're going to open up with b4. Okay, he goes for a different opening, and he's already blundered. He's already lost his rook and his bishop, and that will be a resign, if I know anything. No idea what he was doing there. That happens sometimes. Players are just foolish, and they make the mistake. Try that again. Bishop. Okay, so this is the move, right? So if he now plays knight, brilliant. We now kick the knight away. He has to go there, makes the mistake, and now that knight is lost, right? That knight can go nowhere. It cannot go to these two squares because and that's the reason. That's why that position is so strong, so powerful, and so majestic, because it just works. And really, that's all there is to that opening. From this move forward, it's just about utilizing that advantage that we just have to bring down the enemy pieces. So we're just going to play the chess from this point on very slowly, and just hoping we don't make too many or any mistakes at all. Let's bring this piece out. We're going to be ready to castle here. He's bringing out his queen, which is fine. Very fine. We may even offer a queen trade, but I think for now what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask him, do you want to perhaps let me defend this pawn? Keep in mind, if this bishop moves, we're going to go grab that pawn, I think. Okay, he will do that, which is okay. We're going to now bring the bishop back here. He can now munch on that piece if he wants to. He chooses not to, so we're going to now take the bishop. We're going to castle immediately. Now he's making the mistake of not picking up the free. This pawn is actually free, it's hanging. So if this queen was to take, I wouldn't be able to take back, right? Because this pawn cannot move because it's in check. We can talk about that in the analysis of the game. He has now picked up that. We're going to ask him, do you want to go and do a trade? I'm still leaving this thing hanging. I shouldn't do that because he could utilize it to find a way to protect that as soon as possible. Good. So he made that mistake. Now it's just the end game and finding a way to checkmate the black king. So we're going to try to do this as fast as possible. We have a minute and a half on the clock. So you want to make precise moves and dominate this game of chess. Okay, nothing is hanging there, so we're going to just defend against the threat of check. We're going to push this forward. We're going to figure out a way to get into a mating position here. A rook lift. Keep in mind, I want to keep most of my pieces on black squares as the enemy is playing on the opposite colors. We're going to do this. Getting ready for a check now. That's fine. And we're going to still take that, and we're just going to push this pawn forward. Not the greatest of endgames. We managed to blunder one of our pieces, but we're going to get a queen into the game now, and there's no way he can stop it. So this pawn will promote to a queen on the next move, and I think he will probably resign here or not. Queen comes into the game. He might go for a check. He doesn't. In that case, let's bring in the checkmating pattern. Like this. And this. And now it's a case of the so-called zigzag, meaning this piece goes there. Queen will slide over to the top. And that is checkmate. Game one. And a beautiful game at that. And what you can do on chess.com if you use this platform is actually use the analysis tab, which will now show you more or less where you were making the mistakes, where the game was going in one direction. You can use this column here, which shows you the moves. These are all book moves. These are all moves that are known, and this is where you see the mistake, right? And the knight was picked up. The rest of the game was more or less flawless until we made this mistake, right? Which is where the enemy could have picked up this knight for free. Again, this also was a blunder. So when you do a game, when you're limited to 3 minutes of time, you will make a lot of mistakes. You'll make a lot of blunders, and that is sort of what you have to react to. Again, this here was a blunder from me, and then a blunder from him, and on and on and on. And then the rest of the game, I think, here was relatively flawlessly played, with the exception of losing this rook, perhaps, but the pawn push, and that is it. I personally really enjoy chess, and I really enjoy the process of having to think fast, having to think about all the different moves. It's an intricate game because if you ever get to play it with your friends in person, it's a game of ego. It's a game of investment. It's a game of minds. It's a different type of experience than any other sport you might encounter, because it really solely contains this valuable contrast of the way people think. I think you meet people, you understand people, you learn about people when you play chess with them. You see how they think. Some are extremely offensive. They will continue to attack. They're very dangerous. They like playing the queen very early on in the game. Others, they're very defensive. They like playing, a very slow game. And usually what tends to happen is when I know people for a long time and I play chess with them, and you see the way they play chess, the rest of their life makes sense. You can pull correlations from the way an individual plays chess to the way they tend to live their life. And that's why I find it so brilliant. And I recommend that everybody, learns a certain amount of chess. It doesn't have to be a lot. It can be, 1 or 2 matches per day. You can do it for free on chess.com. You could do it for free on League Chess. But whatever you do, just do it, because I bet you it is a worthwhile investment of your time. That's it for me today. I don't want to drag this one on longer than it has to be. If you're interested in more chess content, put it in the comment section below, and I'll try to make a few more. Until then, you can find me playing chess every couple of days on twitch.tv/theOrangeDoom. And until next time, take care and safe flying. Love you all. Bye-bye.